Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Hi, this is Adam Schwartz, President of SSI Strategy, stepping in for Kim Kushner, who's out on maternity leave this week. And I'm here with Ramin Farhood and Benit Maru. Benit is a Senior Vice President of our medical team at SSI Strategy, currently acting Chief Medical Officer at a client and participating and helping in a number of medical issues for a number of our clients. And we're here to debrief on our conversation from the last episode with Victoria Nikklas, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Oak Hill Bio. So thanks so much for joining Ramin and I, Benit.
No worries. Happy to be here.
One of the things I was thinking we could potentially jump into first, we obviously had a sort of long-ranging conversation with Victoria, spanning much of her career and what she's been doing recently at Oak Hill Bio. But I thought one concept that was really interesting about the early part of her career as she moved into pharma was her decision-making process of coming out of academia and into pharma and having to sort of think through and combat this kind of message and concept of being a sellout, and if moving from academia into pharma somehow, has this negative connotation to it. And I know, Benit, that's something you've had to go through yourself a little bit. Wondering if you have any thoughts or maybe a different take or similar to Victoria.
Yeah, no, just everything that she was saying kind of resonated quite a lot, actually. And, that perception, unfortunately, of selling out, it is still there, and I think it is there with kind of the old guard, let's say, whether it's the medics or the academics. In my own experience, I was warned, if you leave, you're never going to be able to come back. You're kind of in an institute, especially in neurology, in a very specific area of neurology. What I will say though is I do think that there is a bit of a nuance in terms of how it is perceived, because I think with her background and her experience, the experience she brings and her actually wanting to put patients first is helping break that barrier of actually being a sellout, in air quotes, or just being after the money. I do think sometimes, because, she made this comment, like you're going to be biased, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. She kind of talked around that. I do think if somebody has come straight out of medical school or whatever it may be, they're less politically aware. And, that's no disrespect to them. It's just more, they just haven't had that grounding, whereas you've gone through the system, you've gone through academia, when to say, what not to say. And I do think bringing that level of rigor is actually needed in industry. And I think, it's people like her that are helping change the perception, that it's not all just about being in it for the money.
Right. It's almost like her being part of the team becomes part of the solution, right? So obviously many physicians and scientists are going to come straight from medical school or their PhD into the industry, but the more we have a balanced approach and we have folks also coming from academia and the more experience they've had there, they kind of have a different perspective maybe. And so they're bringing something different to the industry.
Yeah, I agree, 100% agree. And I think, one of the things that, that she talked about the bias and things like that is like, no, we have rigor, ethical development, for example. And if you're kind of bringing that in and you're bringing that in from the industry perspective and you're applying the rigor, that you've applied, whether it be in clinics or in academia, and it is absorbed, it's taken, right? People do listen to you as well. And you're saying, there are some differences which she talked to in terms of like how she needed to get up to speed in things. Everything's at 3 million miles an hour. That there is that nuance, but applying that rigor and having the standing to do that, I do think actually adds credence to what you're doing. I do think that that's a boon for the industry.
I agree, and I agree with you, Benit, 100%. I actually seen that the individuals that are really successful when they do make that transition, coming from academia and being a research scientist coming to the pharma, is that they become that voice. They almost bridge the industry and the academia together in a very powerful and beneficial way for the patient. They become that voice, that face. They bring in their expertise with them. to educate also the pharma on the industry side, to making sure that they understand what's really important to the patient, what's really important to the study, and all of the knowledge that they bring to with them. It's is absolutely necessary for success of the industry as well.
And Ramin, what about that point about the patients? You guys both kind of highlighted that as sort of a key piece, and I know Victoria talked about this perspective that you're deserting the patients by not being as close to them when you step out of an academic perspective. And she obviously had a thought about it that obviously the relationship changes, but you're still focused on the patients, and in some ways, maybe even you can have a broader impact on more patients, right? Because you don't have this one-to-one relationship. What's your guys' experience with that? And I know Benit in particular, I think you're still actually involved in some patient-related activities more directly, right? Outside of your efforts at SSI.
Yeah, and I think I think it is true. You kind of do have that feeling like, you're day in, day out, you're in the clinic, you're on the bedside, you're doing your multidisciplinary team meetings, you're helping those individual patients, and it is a challenge to think I'm letting them down, but in hindsight, you're not, because you're going up a notch and you're actually able to make a difference, not just at your local level or your regional level, but much more on a global level. You may be one of the lucky few that is able to get involved in guideline development, and those guidelines are then applicable, across the world. But that is a rare few clinicians. That isn't everybody. But being able to work, and have basically, essentially, the world is your oyster in that sense, and being able to kind of change the landscape globally outside of what your pocket is, I think that's something else as well. For me, for example, I was only ever in adults, I'd only ever treated adults. I did some pediatric training, but being able to work in areas that I'd never thought I'd be able to, and actually, to have developed therapies in, devastating pediatric diseases, that is something completely different as well. So I do think there's a fulfillment in the overall, and I think being able to kind of translate that experience, because you know what it's like, when you're delivering bad news to the family, to the, whomever it may be, you take that feeling, because it is a sucker punch, right? It genuinely is. It's like, it's one of the hardest things you'll ever have to do, but you carry that with you, and then applying that knowledge in terms of how you communicate and how you communicate with it to advocacy, because she talked about working with advocacy, still being heavily involved, and think that everything you've learned from the shop floor is extremely useful moving forward. So you're not really you're not directly with them, you're still having much more of an impact with the patients.
Right. And you miss your patients, right? I mean, especially if you're in a chronic disease. I mean, the patients have been your patients, some of them from a very young age until, and you see them, grow through life and go through life, and with their chronic disease. And obviously you're going to miss them. It's hard to give them that message that you are moving on to something, another role that is not necessarily going to have that day to day. And your patients are going to also miss you quite a bit too, and they probably may not be happy, but it's for a bigger cause. And I think that's the main driver for a lot of the folks that I've seen, that they make that decision to go from their academia to the industry for that global kind of an impact that Benit was referring to. I think that's kind of like one of the key drivers for them, that they want to bring that knowledge, expertise as a much more impact and a higher level to the society. And that's still a hard. There's a feeling part to it that is hard, right? But it's also at the same time is necessary to do.
I think with that as well, just, it's true, it is difficult, but I think, going back to, like, there's lessons that you've learned, that having to deliver bad news, whatever it may be, kind of being really cautious in your messaging, that is something, that obviously comes into the biotech arena as well, because, she talked about the guarded optimism. When she mentioned guarded optimism, to me, that resonated quite a lot, especially because you may have hope for a patient, you may not. You need to kind of think what you need to do, but that actually does apply in the biotech side as well, because, you have to be mindful of what you're saying, of how you're saying. You may see some early data that's coming in. It may be extremely, it may look great, but you don't want to get ahead of yourself. And to me, remembering those scenarios, where you kind of have to be really careful what you say to a patient. That to me is a parallel where you think, okay, this is good, but I just need to be careful. And that is kind of, that guarded optimism piece. That's quite a good phrase, actually.
I like that. I like that as well. It also resonated with me that I feel like in medicine in general, and especially when you're talking about developing new therapies, you have to be an optimist. You have to be optimistic. Otherwise, you wouldn't be thinking of these ideas. You wouldn't be taking the steps to even try to get there if you weren't optimistic about the idea. But at the same time, we have to be realistic and we have to be understanding what the limitations are of what we can do, right? Otherwise, we're going to make leaps that maybe are inappropriate. And so you have to have this kind of guardedness to the optimism in order to make sure that you're grounded in some reality, right? And waiting and taking the appropriate steps to test the science and prove things out before you're, sort of just running ahead. I thought that was a really interesting thread.
I was wondering, Bennett, with you working with many clients as an acting CMO, or some of the clients that already have a CMO in place, and you partner with them, especially if they're early on in their career. There's a scientific aspect to what we do, and then there's also a business aspect, right? And what are some of the challenges that you see that some of the CMOs go through, or even you as an acting CMO with a lot of our clients? How do you bring that into to the executive team, and how do you deal with that?
I think one of the challenges that I've seen, I've experienced it myself as well, and this kind of does relate to that guarded optimism, is you kind of have to be extremely mindful of, and you need to be extremely aware of your audience. You need to know who you're speaking to, right? So if you're kind of in amongst your peers at that C-suite, you need to give them just enough information, but you don't need to go into that level of detail. You don't want to, it's kind of that 30,000 foot view, but then, with one sentence or two sentences, which gives you, that 10-foot view and then back up again. That needs to be something that's actually extremely important. And I do think that people can sometimes struggle with that. I struggle with that at the beginning of my career, but, and currently I think that's where people will struggle. People are struggling at the moment as well, in terms of the level of messaging. How granular do you need to be? Too scientific, not scientific enough. I think that's one of the challenges. So it's communication, I guess, Ramin. And knowing the audience and how to communicate. And I think that's some brilliant people out there, and I think sometimes they just get tripped up in terms of how it's communicated. In my experience, people that have had, a lot of experience in development, but also medical affairs, that's a really interesting and nuanced kind of, training and background, because you kind of, from a medical education perspective, all your KOL engagements, you have a different, the audience. You're not going to go and teach a KOL the disease because they know that, right? You find different ways of talking to them. If you've only ever done development, you may not have that nuance. So I do think, it doesn't matter where you are in your career, what's been your stepping stone, because she went into the milk company first, and then into Takeda. She was a global medical, she was working for medical affairs, so her tenure within industry is actually is good for her, because she can get into the weeds, she can come back out, she knows the type of messaging that she needs to give. She did make a comment around, obviously, investors, and being mindful of what you message there is, but I think one of the, going back to what you asked, I do think it's getting the messaging right. I think that's where CMOs struggle. And I think CMOs also struggle in knowing when to ask for help, especially if you're quite a junior CMO, because you think it's all on your shoulders and it's going to look bad if you're asking people for help. So they're the struggles that I have seen. And I think with maturity, you do get that. She worked in that neonatal clinic where you have lots of different experts, of different disciplines. She's got no problem asking people for help because that's what their expertise is. And this goes to my point of somebody that's actually got quite a good tenure in medicine and in academia. They're comfortable in asking for help when needed. You may not have that with somebody that's gone straight into industry. So again, it's another plug of that bridge that can help.
Yeah, I think there's two threads that you brought up there that are really interesting, Bennett. One is this idea of the CMO in particular, they have to really be able to work in a multifunctional kind of environment, and they have a lot of different stakeholders that they're dealing with, right? And some of those stakeholders may have an appetite or understanding of more scientific nuance and information, or they may need more scientific and nuanced information, right? Depending upon their role in the organization or what they're going to be participating in, and right. And then others might need it at a higher level because they're either more in a business function or, and in Victoria's point, like maybe from an investor perspective, right? And so on the investor perspective, she talked about this idea of providing clarity and certainty to them. So you need to have kind of a clear plan, and you need to be certain in the approaches that you're going to be taking to be reassuring to them, but obviously also needs to be tethered in reality because you need to be giving them a good picture of what you're talking about. And, you really, as the CMO, you need to be, kind of dialing all that information, right, based on what do I need to share with this stakeholder? What do they need in order to be able to execute and understand and help me in the right way, right? And then the other piece that you brought up was just the idea of delegation, right? And there's so many functions that you're performing in terms of a CMO. You need to be able to rely on a team around you because no CMO is going to be great at everything that is part of their responsibility.
The interesting and the difficulty is that the whole company expects that you know all the answers, right? And science, and that's a lot of pressure, right? You go to the board of directors, they expect that you know all the answers. You're in front of the investors. Investors are asking you a question. They expect that you know all the answers. And we all know that the science is not black and white. It's not always all good or all bad. And there's usually something in between. So even being able to kind of tease out what you're going to communicate and how you're going to communicate it. And a lot of times, quite honestly, you need more data to be more, your messaging be more confirmed. And that's a challenge too, as well. Right, Benit?
It is. No, I 100% agree. And I think, just prepare the best you can. I mean, she said also, one of the things, like, there's no book on how to be a CMO. She speaks to peers, colleagues, and friends that have been there. And I think that is probably one of the best. Just speak to people. They'll share information with you, and they'll say to you, like, you could be in completely different area of medicine, but investors will usually ask questions, around certain themes. So don't be afraid to ask people, what were the themes? Not giving away any confidential information, but just get prepared, right? And the fact that having that network and the fact that she's offering to help people is brilliant because she's had that help herself. And again, that's not necessarily delegation, but it's knowing where your weaknesses are and actually saying, look, this is where I need some more information, this is where I need more support. So just build a framework around, okay, well, so if there's these themes that are coming out from these types of investors, these are the questions that I could be asked, related to the product that I'm working on. Ramin, you're right. Science is evolving, but if you have an idea of what the themes are, you should be prepared ultimately in that sense, right? As well. So I do think all of that does tie in together. But again, it's just having that confidence to reach out to people and actually ask to say, this is what this is happening. It's the first time I've ever done this. Do you have any input? Do you have any help? And again, going back, like, I think CMOs fail because they're too scared to do that for whatever reason.
Right. No, I remember that when we had to go to the board, and this was a practice that we learned. I mean, you always learn by your mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Is that we kind of got ahead of it, and we asked the CEO, well, what is the board interested in? What do they want to know about this study? Right? What are some of the thinkings? What are some of the, because we were not necessarily on a daily communication with the board, but the CEO was. And that helped us quite a bit to prepare. And as you mentioned, that is so important. And as simple as it sounds, it's something that we don't do enough of it because we are busy. It's not like we don't think of it, but we are busy until the day of the presentation or the investor meeting or whatever the case will be. But the practice makes it such a big difference, and also understanding what your audience is asking out there, so you can actually practice and be ready and prepared based on what they're interested in, not based on what you want to communicate. And then those two may be sometimes not quite aligned and challenging.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It actually was making me think about, like, if we get a little bit practical around some of it, something that I don't really see in the medical office, or at least many CMOs doing, that is kind of a discipline that you could maybe borrow from change management or communications practices, is this whole idea of, like, stakeholder mapping, message mapping, like thinking through what is my stakeholder engagement strategy overall, right? Who do I need to message to? What information am I messaging to them? And then thinking through that entire approach, right? So you could have, well, here are the key things that we're going to need to regularly be communicating to the board, to the rest of the C-suite, to my team, to the rest of the organization, to advocacy organizations, to other external stakeholders, to investors, right? And you could map all of those things out and be thinking about, what granularity and level of data that you need. I think we do that probably informally in many different ways, but I really haven't seen a medical team doing that in a very robust way outside of maybe medical affairs, where it's a very communications focused orientation, right? So I don't often see the CMO doing that.
No, you don't, and I think that's why kind of CMOs that have had some kind of med affairs background or experience does help, because obviously they've got they've got that, they know that structure, and that's kind of where that sometimes help. But again, that doesn't mean that you have to have med affairs background or training. I just think it helps ultimately. And with some of the folks that I've worked with and supported, that are new CMOs that don't have that, they're great because they listen, they ask your advice, they ask your opinion, you're there to support them, and it's what they're willing and comfortable to take on. Ultimately, I think from our perspective, once we are there and we're supporting them, we kind of become that trusted partner. So it is easier for us to kind of impart what we know and help wrap around them. It is a bit more challenging when it's somebody you don't know, and then from our perspective, you kind of have to gain their trust as well. So yeah, I do think that's important. But you're right, that structure doesn't really exist outside of med affairs, I guess. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. So another piece that Victoria kind of talked about, and Benit, you touched on this a little bit just a couple minutes ago, about the idea of like gathering information, learning from others, mentoring others, which sounds like an amazing thing that Victoria is very like proactively doing. I really loved when hearing her talk a little bit about that. But I thought one of the threads that she also brought up was this idea of like learning from others, but being true to yourself. And I thought that was such a great idea, right? It's so easy when you're doing something new to maybe hear from someone who's done it before successfully and think, okay, I need to apply that exact practice. And maybe with enough experience and wisdom, you kind of realize like, okay, what worked for them probably isn't exactly what's going to work for me. So I need to find a way to adapt, right? How do I take the pieces from all these different people that have given me this great advice and make sure that I'm using it in a way that then works for me? Because we each have our own skill sets. We all have our own personalities. And so we have to play to our own strengths and accomplish it in the way that we know we can.
Yeah, no, I think that's what she said is actually super important. Just make sure you do stay true to yourself, because I've seen this, with people that we've worked with as well. There's people that have been fantastic at what their job is. They're fantastic investor facing, and you observe them and you want to watch them just for that experience, and then you don't want to fall into that pitfall of trying to be them, because that kind of goes again, like the way that they may describe something, learn, observe what, how they're delivering it in a way, but take that learning and apply it to how you would deliver something as well. So I do think that stay true to yourself, because if you try to be somebody else, it doesn't necessarily work. Yeah, no, that was good to hear. Actually, just stay true to yourself. I think that is important.
Maybe one last thread we could bring up that we didn't really touch on yet, that I thought was really interesting, was Victoria's kind of movement from large pharma into emerging biotech. And there was a couple of pieces there. One was around the out licensing and how some of that works. And then the other piece was this idea of the depth of knowledge that you need, and how as a CMO at a biotech, you essentially need to be the expert in everything, right? And you need to get really deep in everything. Whereas when you are in a large pharma organization, you have this great vast team and breadth around you that you can rely on, right? So you really just need, as she said, the sound bites, right? You need to know their expertise and what the important part was, but then you are going to use that information however you need to leverage it, but you don't need to get as deep. Whereas in a biotech environment, you don't have all of that around you, right? So you do need to get that depth of information in order to be able to execute on your role. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I can say nothing other than wholeheartedly agree with her in that fact that, when you switch from one to the other, it is true. Like, you've kind of gone from being a person that's a SME in one area, let's say, for want of a better phrase, to being the person that is the jack of all trades as well. And it is tough. And she's made the comment around CMC and needed to get into the level of detail that she kind of got into. As a CMO, you don't necessarily need to know, but you do need to know what the CMC strategy is. You do need to get more into the weeds as a CMO, because actually everything that they're doing from a manufacturing perspective, which lot is going to be useful for your toxicology, which can you do in human trials, that all needs to plan and stagger to what you're potentially doing from a development approach as well. And then different jurisdictions are going to have different requirements, based on when product is released and what the testing is. You would never need to know that in a larger industry, but you need to kind of know that actually there's a lot more there which has an impact on what you're doing. Before you're just that one cog as part of a larger machine. Now you're several cogs part of that machine. So understanding which cog does what and how it actually impacts your delivery, it doesn't necessarily take time to get used to. It's just be aware of the fact that there's so much more to learn, and people will ask you things that you wouldn't, you have that soundbite moment, but you do need to go a few layers deep. But also, you should remember, it's okay to say, actually, it's a really good question. I don't have that at the tip of my fingertips. I'll get back to you depending on what setting you're in. I do think again, going back to where CMOs fail, sometimes CMOs, emerging CMOs, rather than just making that statement and just admitting, like, look, I don't know, I'll come back to you, they go off on a tangent and try and answer. That can sometimes have a detrimental impact as well. So
and that probably dovetails a little bit, and as you were describing that and the need to get depth, it almost feels like it could come in conflict with the idea that we were discussing before about delegating. And you need to have a team around you. You need to delegate. You're not going to be the expert in everything. You shouldn't expect that you have to be the expert in everything. Obviously, in a really small organization, that's more increasingly challenging, right? Because we know some environments, obviously, CMO is the only person in the medical office initially. So there you do, there's no one to delegate to. But obviously, as you build your team or you build your external advisors and leaning on, other organizations, consultants, et cetera, that can support you, you then have others around you that you can delegate some of these activities to. And it seems like, you need to find that. I don't know if you have suggestions there, Benit, for finding the right answer there, or tricks or things you've seen that have worked in terms of balancing between, being able to delegate to others, but also making sure that you're in the details enough that you can help make the decisions, that you can, be the knowledge expert that Victoria was describing, that you kind of do need to be as a CMO.
And I think, I mean, if there was one simple solution, we probably wouldn't be sitting here, right? Yes, in answer to that question. But I think it's a culmination of things. Ultimately, like, if you are that one person, that is just going to be challenging. You basically need to find the time and understand, talk to as many people as you can. I mean, I'd advocate for additional support as soon as possible. I realize that may not be doable, but that then generally is again going to be a function of time management. There's going to be a need to time, when you kind of start to educate yourself on things that you don't know, but that does become challenging, because as the organization grows, you're so used to being the font of knowledge, it's hard for you to let go as well. So that does become a conundrum in itself. So my suggestion there is actually just ask for help earlier and just ask for that additional support, because if you start going down that rabbit hole, it's very hard to get out. I think that's kind of that. If it's a team, which does have some consultants, or you do have some stuff, I would leverage them as much as you can. For me, with the organization that we're working at the moment, I'm as transparent as I can be with them. It's a small team, but we have weekly CMO meetings, as transparent with them, and say, look, this is what's happening. This is what's going in the organization. This is where these questions are going to come. Investors are asking about X, then they're asking about Y. I don't necessarily, I'm making the team aware. I need your help. Give me as much information as you can, which is digestible, small bite-sized manageable chunks, which could help address that. Bring that, together, have that in a forum. So give us that information. So to me, that's the delegation part. And it's basically running a team, a small team, giving them enough just being as transparent as you can be, because they feel part of the team, they feel part of what's happening in terms of the development of the organization. But what you're also doing is, you're bringing them along with you, but you're also learning. It then becomes a bi-directional discussion. And that's kind of where I get my insights from, because then, CEO or the president of the company asks me a certain question, I'll know. And,
Right.
if I'm in a meeting and, in this virtual world at the moment, I know that I can send somebody a message, whether it be through, a Slack or Zoom, Teams chat or whatever it may be. And because you've built that trust with them, they'll give you the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
I think that, to me, that's the way it's delegation via conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. It's all about communication, right? That's a key to teamwork and team management is communication, right? And making sure that you're working really closely and effectively with your organization so that you have the information that you need, and that your team has the information that they need in order to be able to perform effectively.
And just acknowledge where you, just be honest with yourself, and this is one part of staying true to yourself. It's like, look, I know where my gaps are. I do, sometimes they're a hard lesson to learn. Sometimes they're obvious, but ask for feedback from people, see how you're doing. And then, the feedback that you get is like, okay, well, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. Try and, your behavior then change that way. Just be receptive to it, because the more feedback you seek, the better you get. But again, that's trust building as well. But then that gives you enough fuel to then say, actually, this is actually a gap. This is what probably needs plugging in general, from an organizational piece. It all stems from communication, but I do think it is about just being honest with yourself as well. It's just, I can't be everything to everyone as much as you'd love to be.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure you would. Well, maybe that's a great place to wrap up, Bennett. It was great talking to you and debriefing a little bit on our conversation with Victoria, which I thought was a really great episode. So thanks so much for your time. Appreciate the discussion.
Yeah, no worries. It was genuinely great. 25 years in academia and then 7 in industry. I think, it's been, I personally think that that's the right thing. I mean, maybe it's because it mirrors what I did, but I think it gives you, I think the perspectives you gain are invaluable in that sense, and the flexibility she talked about, the one, about the transferable skills. I think, she has a lot of that. It was good. It was a good listen.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Bennett.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.